Hello. I'm going to start today with trying to express what I'd say to President Biden if he were to ask me, should I depict Trump in this general election that will be coming up after the conventions? I think it's an important question. I think the answer is not crystal clear, so I'll get to that in a minute. As part of my practice, for this Man on a Mission live stream every Monday and Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time is part of my practice to start with something small, because I think that's the best way to make a connection with what I imagine to be the interests of the people who might tune in to listen to me. And there's a problem that the mission I've got has got to do with a big picture, a very big picture, and something I think very important that I have to offer about it. But let's start where people more of the time actually are, which is looking at the world around us. And we live in these very interesting times when it seems as though a whole lot of people have become aware, that there's a battle going on between democracy in America and fascism. Uh, this has been something which has been visible to me in a little way starting in the early 90s, but in a big way starting in 2004. So we're watching how the presidential election is a major showdown in that battle that's come into focus for a wide swath of this country. Thank God, none too late. I mean, none too soon, as this presidential election is going to decide something quite fundamental, at least for the short term. If democracy should win at the polls, I think that that's going to be it's potentially a really big boost to the outcome. But there will be other things that need to be done, regardless of the outcome of the election. I've talked about that in previous episodes about we've got a Republican base right now that it's got some real problems in it. There are a lot of, let's just say, this is actually part of how I think about it. There are a lot of good people who are aligning themselves with a political force that really could reasonably be called evil, which, by the way, I define as a coherent force that consistently works to make the world more broken. So we got other things to do, but if Trump wins, there's a danger that could be not reversible in 4 years. Whether we have another election or not, or whether our elections become like the ones that Putin has, who knows? But we don't have any guarantees that we can survive a Donald Trump second term. So everything about how it's absolutely essential in my view, and in my heart, I feel this way. It's absolutely essential that Biden wins this election. And it's not because Biden is himself belong on Mount Rushmore, though I think he's got some substantial virtues. And I've talked about some of his shortcomings, but he's run a pretty good administration and he's accomplished a lot. Don't think we get him on the Mount Rushmore, but it's not because of that we really need for Biden to win. It's really that we need Trump to lose. That is the essence of it. I was talking to my wife over the weekend about, how many, if one took a list of 100 Americans, randomly selected, and asked ourselves, what proportion of them would be worse to put as president of the United States than Trump? I don't know the answer to that. But I suspect that it's very, very small. And in fact, it's not inconceivable to me that Trump is like unusually, rarely bad to be as president. It may be that out of 100 random Americans, you couldn't find anybody worse for the country to have as president. I don't know quite how to compute that kind of probability, but he is, if he were as totally incapable, like some stroke victim, bedridden, we would be in a lot better shape because he is capable. He's capable of various things that have been hard to quite sift through. And he uses all of his capabilities to do things that are damaging to the country and to the world. I mean, he really fits that definition of a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. So it's because we need to avoid having Donald Trump wield the powers of the presidency, which people that I respect, and I agree with them, say that it really could be the end of American democracy, and that kind of thing can last for a long time. I mean, some kinds of mistakes, democracy is good at correcting. But if you don't have democracy, you can go a long way down a very dark road with the unaccountable power on top. In 1945, you look at Germany, hardly one stone on top of another. That's what it took to get the Nazi regime out of power. Look at Russia right now. It's not in the shape Germany was in 1945, but wow, what a terrible mess that country is. Its best people being murdered by its most powerful people. I mean, that is not what you want a society to be like. And engaged in a war that's going to tarnish the reputation of the country for a generation or more. I mean, the Germans took a long time to live down what they became. Yeah, you can be left with something pretty dark for a long time. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 gave the Russians a regime that was less nightmarish at the end, as it moved into Brezhnev and Gorbachev, etc., than in Stalin. But it was still a pretty terrible thing, and it took, 1917 to 1990, 91, long time. So we do not want Trump to win. So to get to the specific problem. All right, so Trump has said that he wants to debate Biden. And I can believe it or not believe it. The not believe it is you can't believe anything he says. That's part of it. I mean, he's incredible. But the not believe it is also because we watched him during the Robert Mueller time repeatedly say how eager he was to testify. But he never did, and he never was going to. So maybe he's up for debating Biden, maybe he's not. I can see it go either way, but one reason why he might be up for it is if we've watched since 2015 when the Republican debates first happened, nobody really in the Republican field in 2015 found a way of dealing with him successfully. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel did it pretty successfully yesterday on the Oscars, but we watched, he gave Jeb a low energy Jeb or something like that, and Little Marco and Lion Ted. I mean, people tried to get down in the mud with him, and they always ended up not as effective as the pig that they had joined in the mud. So, and then there's what happened with Hillary. Do you remember how Trump behaved in that? In particular, I'm thinking of what Hillary subsequently, I think in her memoir or something, she really regretted how she handled Trump coming away from his podium or whatever it was. And as she had the floor, he was looming over him like some kind of ogre. And she wished in retrospect that she had said, "Back off, creep." And I wish she had too. But nobody's bested him in the debate format. He stayed away from the Republican debates for obvious reasons. He had no reason to give them the look of being sort of on a level with him. He had every advantage, and standing on the stage with him, with his so-called challengers, would have been giving them something at his expense. And he's got, people talk about how stupid he is. And he is an effing moron in a lot of ways, like Tillerson said, as Secretary of State. But he's got some instincts about how do you go toe to toe with somebody in the fighting with positioning and words and such, and coming out on top. So he has reasons why he might want to debate Biden. I don't know how that, back in September of 2020, there was a debate between Biden and Trump that was really, really ugly, the way he behaved, Trump. And I don't know what the impact of that was. This is where he was ranting and interrupting and running over, and the one in which he said to the at the stimulus of a question from one of the moderators about basically asking him to repudiate political violence or something like that. I don't remember the exact question, but he said to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. And people heard that. I think the Proud Boys heard it as only ostensibly being about, a stand back was to supposedly take the position that any American politician is obliged to take, which is we play by the rules. But he doesn't play by the rules, and he communicated that with, okay, stand back, but then undoing that with a stand by. He was very ugly, and he was ugly in a way that was it was a scene of ugly bullying, and it put Biden in an awkward position. Again, it's, do you get down in the mud with the pig? He's at home in the mud, and Biden's no pig. I think he did okay defending himself and calling out what Trump was doing. I think he did okay, but it wasn't a good thing. It wasn't. It was giving him another opportunity to damage the American political system. And that's a consideration. I think I might start out, if Biden asked me what I thought he should do about debating. And he won't ask me, but on the other hand, I do have a way available to me that if I had some really good idea, I could get these thoughts I'm about to express to you, or some better version of them, probably into Biden's inner circle. I've managed a couple of things through what I've got going for me, which is limited, but nothing. It's in some ways the least marginal I've been, and I put myself out with my better human story as having something important to offer, but I don't inflate my status. I've been for a half century or whatever, while I've had something important to say, which has gotten bigger and more important. I've been mostly a pretty marginal person. I'm not on. I wouldn't be on the top. I mean, you'd have to have a long list before you get down to me in terms of impact and influence and stuff like that. So I don't. I just tell it like I see it, and not to inflate or deflate. But anyway, I would start off, if I were trying to convey some useful thoughts to Biden. And by the way, as I start out, and probably as I end up, I'm not certain what the best thing for Biden to do would be. But two things I would want. One is that if he doesn't debate Trump, it should not look like he's doing that out of weakness. It can't be like he's ducking a fight. I mean, like the first time we see Shane in town be getting bullied by, and not having his gun and not fighting back. We don't want Biden to look to any of the electorate as somebody that is afraid of the fight. Really good to see him come out as a fighter in this State of Union address, because that's one of the problems is that the American people see Trump as strong and him as weak and frail. And the great thing about the State of the Union address was he was not weak and frail. Some people thought it was overly combative to come right out of the box like he did, denouncing Trump. I think that he does himself a favor to err in the direction of people saying, "Oh, that's too much." I had said actually earlier that day that here on this thing that there's a video back there from last Thursday, I think, called the Great American Anti-Fascist Campaign. And a part of that is for Biden to be the fighter, to land blows on an ongoing basis, for that to be his posture. There is no danger, I don't think, that people are going to see him as too aggressive, because he's got this image that he has to overcome. Of somebody that is frail. It goes along with the age thing, but it's also separate from the age thing. That's why I have proposed that Biden challenge Trump. They both go to the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or something, and with the agreement that they'll be totally checked over and we'll make the results public. I think that Biden would come out with a better bill of health. But I also think that the American people are responding, at a deeper level than is easily reached by medical reports, which is that Trump acts like a powerful person. And there is deep in the American psyche that we want our heroes and our protectors to be strong. We like Superman and Batman, and we like our Western heroes, our John Waynes, people who never back down from a fight. So one consideration is however you orchestrate how you're going to handle if Trump keeps challenging for a debate, how are you going to handle it so that one outcome to avoid is that the American people will interpret it in a way which reinforces the vulnerability that Biden clearly has of not being the strong alpha male that people have always turned to protect them in a dangerous world. I mean, there's lots of anthropology about how the king has to be full of vital powers to occupy the role of king, and the various rituals by which the king has to fight to maintain his throne, or whoever kills him becomes king. It goes very deep, I think, in us humans. And I don't think that it's put there evolutionarily. My sense is that as we evolved as hunter-gatherers, the idea of a protector was not so important, because, well, you got dangers, you got your saber-toothed tigers and all that stuff. You got the bear and the lion, but I don't think that in these fairly limited-sized bands, there would be a single individual who would play the role of, like father to the rest of the society. I think that comes with what's important in my Better Human Story, which is what happens when you get into civilization. Uh, Warfare inevitably becomes chronic. I won't go into why that's inevitable, but it is. And you get the war of all against all, and you got these societies that are fairly big, and each one tends to be ruled from the top down by some major, a tyrant or whatever, and you get the fate of the society rests on the king, the emperor, the tyrant, to a degree that wasn't true in pre-civilized times. That now we need a commander in chief. I mean, we in the United States. I'm leaping over all the, the ancient empires and stuff like that. But we in the United States elect a commander in chief who, while checked in domestic matters considerably by the Congress, is really in charge of our foreign affairs and as commander-in-chief of our military. And in a world in which, as has been the case since the rise of civilization, there's a war of all against all, nothing to stop Putin from invading his neighbor. To have somebody who will navigate, strategize, whatever, in this dangerous world so that we survive, because history is the story of peoples being conquered, often whole cities slain, all kinds of terrible outcomes to losing. And so it has mattered to our ancestors for the last 10,000 years or 5,000, depending whether you want to start it with the beginnings of the civilizing process or you want to wait till you get to the empires that emerge with cities in places like the Nile and the Tigris, Euphrates, etc. Depending on we've had millennia of experience where we've got people getting traumatized or evading traumatizing experiences based on how well the protector in that anarchic wider world plays his hand. So we want strength there. We want somebody who can play the game of war of all against all in a successful way. Somebody who makes good decisions strategically, like not nixing the nuclear agreement with Iran that Obama managed to get. I believe, I mean, I know there's mixture of feelings about that, but I believe that Trump has made things a whole lot worse in terms of the dangers, nuclear dangers in the Middle East. We want somebody who navigates it well. FDR, I think, was very good at it. Turned out Truman was pretty good at it. And Eisenhower, he had commanded the whole D-Day invasion. And so I think people felt, this is a guy who knows how to triumph over our evil adversaries in a military way. So Biden needs to come across as a fighter, and he needs to avoid coming across as a wimp. And one of the things that is very fundamental to what I have tried without a great deal of success to convey to liberal America about this crisis that's been gathering for a generation, which is the evil or this coherent destructive force may have arisen and taken over the right, now giving us this human monster, Donald Trump. This, but he's just the guy, the Republican wolf was already visible for a long time before we got to Trump, who took off the sheep's clothing. That the darkness and destructiveness reside on the American right. And we on the liberal American or the anti-fascistic side, we're the good guys. But that's not the fundamental truth of how things got to be in this fraught, dangerous condition. It was the whole system. Every part of the American system failed over the last generation, including the liberal side of the equation, the democratic part of the power struggle, that failed to see what was going on and failed to respond to it appropriately. So we need a fighter. And Biden has shown that he seems to understand that. And I find that very encouraging. I think he's far from who I would cast to play that role, because it doesn't deal really to his strengths. I mean, he's not an orator, and he doesn't have the physical qualities like a John Wayne to bring to the confrontation. But he apparently, from the polling results, a lot of people took a new look at Joe Biden, and various poll numbers regarding how people saw him leapt by 20 points, and sometimes more. So he can do it. I think he can pull it off. But how do you deal then with the debate issue? I think that another central consideration, in addition to wanting the way Biden deals with it to have him come across as strong, I think that the question needs to be, could even be articulated out loud, that this is quoting Biden, I'm thinking about Mr. Trump's invitation or challenge, let's debate. And I'm asking myself, what's the best thing to do for American democracy in this, with respect to such debates? Donald Trump's behavior in past debates has been very damaging to our democracy. He's trampled on some important things about how we Americans conduct our politics. So I wouldn't want that to happen again. I am running as the champion of American democracy. And I want to deal with this challenge in some way that will strengthen our democracy. And part of that is that the voters have a right to see their choices in such a format, for example, of the debate that we've had since Kennedy and Nixon in 1960. And I can't remember, wasn't there one or two where people didn't debate? But in any event, it's become part of the American political process that one of the things that the candidates do is they get in front of a nationally televised audience for a couple hours and deal with questions. How much that shows about how being good at that translates into being good at being president, I'm not sure. People have wondered about that for a long time. But we've got that. And respect at least needs to be paid to that norm. And that norm, I think, has some value because Otherwise, a presidential candidate can basically go all the way to election day without having to deal with anything which isn't already scripted and controlled. You want to know something about who they are besides what they decide to present. So in a debate, you got to deal with things that you didn't know were coming. So I would have Biden, at least in some way, acknowledge that there is value in general. But then I would call attention to. I would want to make the question of, will this be good for American democracy to have a debate with that guy? To make use of that to expose important things about Trump that we need to make sure that the American people perceive. And Biden could say, one of the things that I'm weighing is that this guy doesn't obey the rules. I mean, candidates come in having agreed to a certain set of rules, but he agrees to the rules and then he violates them. And that's very reminiscent of how he dealt with the Constitution. He didn't just agree to abide by the Constitution. He put his hand on a Bible and swore an oath to protect the Constitution, and even that didn't get him to abide by what he had agreed to. That's not good. That's why 3 of the Supreme Court justices have just referred to him several times in a decision about whether he should be disqualified from even being on the ballot because of what he did against the Constitution. They described him as oath-breaking insurrectionist. That has been adjudicated, that he is an oath-breaking insurrectionist. It was adjudicated in Colorado and has been established in a whole variety of ways. So do we want to give him a forum that he has abused in the past by breaking his agreements? Should I refuse to debate him so that American people don't have to witness again somebody getting away with showing contempt for the rules? The same guy who's shown contempt for the law and contempt for the Constitution. So much contempt for the law that he's been indicted 91 times by a grand jury of average Americans. And by then, he also presumably will have been found guilty not only by a civil jury of having essentially raped a woman, but will have been found criminally guilty, probably. It seems expected. I read it's a slam dunk of having violated some important election laws and business laws in the Stormy Daniels hush money election interference case that's going to be jury selection in a couple of weeks. So here we got a guy. Can we get a promise from Donald Trump that he will obey the rules? And what's a promise from this guy worth? A guy who would break his oath with his hand on the Bible. So it's a problem, and I've even thought, should Biden sort of present the issue and then say, I'm going to let the American people decide what they think. After setting the whole thing up, which I haven't finished doing, some way of asking the American people, do you think we should have such a debate in spite of the damaging ways that Donald Trump behaves, the ways that are damaging to our political system? Or do you think that I should simply refuse to debate him because, well, I mean, he refused to debate all those Republicans. He wouldn't stand on the same stage with them. Well, that, he's anybody who wouldn't give the Republican electorate the benefit of seeing him debate those who are challenging him. He's lost some standing to say he's entitled to a debate, and he's disqualified himself in the past by the way he got out and loomed over Hillary Clinton like nobody we'd ever seen in all the many debates we've seen from city council to the presidency. Nobody's ever behaved like that. Anyway, so I think that the debate issue gives Biden a chance to frame the question in terms that call attention to all kinds of important things about Donald Trump, like he breaks his promises and he cheats. I would use the word cheats at many opportunities. And that he does damage to our political system. And I would also, if I were to, I would advise Biden this way, to call attention to the fact that you can't believe anything that Trump says, that he is as far as I know, I believe this man will go down as the most prodigious liar in world history. I mean, the Washington Post or somebody counted his false and misleading statements, and what it amounted to 30-some thousand. But I mean, he's really extraordinary in the lying department. So that can be dramatized, I think, by President Biden in saying, my terms for a debate include that on the stage we will have a little panel of fact finders or fact checkers, and maybe some simple rules about any candidate can refer an issue of did my opponent lie or speak falsely when he said ... to have on standby immediate fact checking, so that when Trump trucks out his lies, and I don't think he would really be capable of avoiding it, because that's what he does. He just presents things with truth having no special status. And to say that any candidate can refer something so that the debate doesn't just go on leaving a lie sitting there being considered credible by the American people who are watching the debate. Not to let the lie has been defeating the truth too much. And so part of the defense of democracy is to set up something so that the lie gets defeated by the truth rather than vice versa. So I might make some kind of fact checking a mandatory part of the process. And in terms of abiding by the rules, I would propose that it be automatic that when a candidate's time to speak is up, there be another 5 seconds or something appropriate for finishing your sentence, and then the microphone will be turned off automatically, so nobody's going to hear what somebody who's disregarding the clock as well as the rules. I believe that Trump has shown more than the usual unwillingness to obey a time limit. I'm not positive about that, but it would make sense. I mean, a central part of Trump's character is that it really, really is not acceptable to him to to be contained uh, by any kind of rule, norm, law, or anything else like that. It's not just, I don't, this is me psychologizing, and I'm something of a psychologist. It's not just that he doesn't, that he wishes to break them if they're in his way. I think he was willing to go somewhat out of his way to break them. Like somebody walking along when the puddles have a little coating of ice. I know people who like to break the ice with their foot and will walk a couple feet off the sidewalk to break some ice. That's how Donald Trump seems to be about anything that would limit him. So a clock going off and saying you got to stop, your turn is over. I think he has, he doesn't want to be to have the experience of obeying. And I think you can imagine the brokenness, the really unhappy experience that at least I envisioned that the idea of having to toe a line is associated with early, hugely painful experience for this guy. Mary Trump, his niece, and a psychologist, is the daughter of Trump's brother, who I think was the firstborn and was dealt with by the father in such a abusive way, I gather. I don't know the details. Mary Trump basically says that her father's ending his life with suicide. What are we talking about, like a 40-year-old or something like that? That basically the father's humiliating treatment is what ultimately killed his son. And it didn't kill Donald Trump, but I think we can see some sign of something when we watch how almost unable to abide by a limitation Donald Trump is. I mean, these gag orders in court, he can hardly restrain himself. He's been found, he just had to put up bond for $91 million because of his defamation of E. Jean Carroll. And then over the weekend, I heard people, including Andrew Weissman, who's sort of my go-to guy for this kind of knowledge, saying that what Trump said in a speech over the weekend really sets up another civil suit for defamation. It's really the same stuff that two different juries have already found against him and penalized him with millions of dollars. So he just seems like he can't stop. Part of the interpretation of that is he's now got a sugar daddy, maybe Elon Musk, so that the financial penalty is no longer troubling to him, and he can let it fly about talking about her being crazy and his whole made up story. And he never had anything to do with this woman. He never even knew her, even though the evidence presented in court enabled a jury unanimously to believe that he was lying about all that and that E. Jean Carroll was telling the truth. But anyway, he's told to stop defaming her. The question was always asked, well, how much is it going to take to get him to stop? And here comes the $83 million thing. And, oh, well, that's a lot. Surely that will get him to stop. Well, apparently not. But anyway, fact finders, fact checkers, I keep on getting that wrong. That could be enough to have Biden put it could be that Trump would not agree to that, in which case Biden's free and clear. I just he refused. He refused to be held to having to speak, uh, uh, to having to avoid. I'm not being articulate, but uh, I think it's very telling. Biden could say that Trump, who supposedly wants to debate, is not willing to debate if there are people around that will catch him when he's lying. And we got a problem having a president. The American people should have recognized that that's a tip off, that this is not a guy you want to have as president. Democracy depends upon truth. Like Vindeman said, that's the guy on Trump's national security staff who testified in the first impeachment trial very patriotically, that in his family culture, the idea was in America, truth matters. And I would think that Biden could take that beautiful line, in America, truth matters. For a democracy to work, truth matters. I mean, you don't want a liar. And this is a guy who is willing to tell a lie that was more destructive than any in American history, which was to tell his tens of millions of followers that the election was stolen, when that was clearly a lie and has been proven to be a lie. So there's a lot of things that Biden could get in there. I guess that's about all that I've got to say. Let's see, do I have anything else to say? No, that's pretty much it. Let's see, do I come down on any position? Am I ready to write this up and send it off in Biden word, as you might say? No, I think that I might come down on using the fact checkers on the stage and the microphone turnoffs as conditions for saying yes. They're both very defensible positions. If Trump were to accept it, the debate might actually be worth having. And if Trump rejected it, Biden would be able to turn we're not having debates, and this is the reason, turn that against Trump. So I guess that's where I come down. That's the little thing I'm going to talk about today, or one of them. Actually, it turned out to be a variety of these things about our American situation. And making connections that they're intended to be suggestive, that when I say that I've got an integrative picture of the story of our species, that it has a certain credibility. Making connections is sort of what I developed the intellectual habit of trying to do, and I've been working at it for, that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, that's about seeing something about what happened to our species that I think puts a lot of fundamental things into an importantly different light. And that's really, man on a mission. That's what I'm here for. And, it's unclear to me. It's not unclear to me whether I'm overstating what I got to offer. What's unclear to me is how much what I have to offer, that I claim puts things in an importantly different light. Things like what kind of creatures we are, and why the story of our species and the human world around us is as broken as it is. And what are the nature of the challenges we have to face? I feel quite convinced that I've got something valid to say, that that needs to be got out there. But what I don't feel clear about is how much that's what people are looking for, whether they really want to see, uh, have a perspective through which to look at the big picture and not have it all make sense, but have some rather important pieces of it make sense, made clear. You know, there were a few years ago when I've been putting out that idea and others that I've built up around it for half a century and more. That's from the University of California Press and it won a prize and stuff like that. But I felt like it would have a real impact on how people thought about things because it really opened up something for me. But I had tried for a lot of years, and I was tempted to allow myself to retire at in my mid 70s. But I kept on feeling like there's something here that just needs to be brought into our thinking because it could really help clarify a lot of stuff that is essential to the question, will human civilization survive for the long haul? Or are we going to destroy ourselves, which I regard as a significant possibility, enough that it upsets me. The chances that someplace along the line sooner or maybe somewhat not so soon, but still within the next not so many generations, we might have a nuclear holocaust. I think that what I have to offer, that larger picture of things, actually could help human civilization survive. Anyway, I struggled with whether or not to just resign myself. I've done what I can do, and let myself, rest back. It's not like I didn't accomplish anything. I just didn't accomplish my super ambitious mission to change the way we understand the whole human story because of certain things I think I can establish that are true. But I kept on being driven back to the thought that, it really could have a beneficial impact. I was afraid to go forward, and there's a certain amount of chutzpah I recognize, and it's just been very uncomfortable for me, and I was very inhibited for many years about making some such claim out loud, that this could really have a beneficial impact, because I imagine that people would just, say that lacks credibility. That I never heard of the guy. Maybe he's crazy. Delusions of grandeur. And I really don't like to think about people seeing me that way. So I was very inhibited. But I decided, I don't have that many years left. And if I don't do it, is there somebody else going to ever do it? I mean, some of it like that is out there, but a lot of it is not. So anyway, I decided I would throw caution to the wind and just go out there and just speak the truth to other people the way I see it myself, rather than to create a divide between this is what I see, but I don't want people to think I'm being grandiose. I just hated that idea. But, I've come to wonder whether I was worrying about the wrong thing in terms of success. I mean, it would be painful for me to be seen as one of these cranks that makes a claim. And then if I think that people are seeing me that way, there's a temptation to say things that people might interpret as bragging. And I don't like to be seen as a braggart either. I don't believe in being a braggart. But so let me just say that my life gave me every opportunity to become the integrator of a lot of pieces into a coherent, integrative vision of the human story. I couldn't have asked for more opportunities to develop in that way, from the family I grew up in to the nature of the education I got. Four world-class universities, in my background, and I've spent the last 50 years utilizing all the things that I developed because of the help of those opportunities I got. Anyway, the one thing that's really makes it understandably difficult to believe that the claims are credible is that if you got that out there and it won a prize, it was featured in Esquire magazine, full page review in the New York Times, made all these bold assertions, you're claiming that it would have all these important ramifications. And here we are 40 years later, and it's not out there playing the role you thought that it would be. It's not an idea that's sort of having a powerful effect on how people understand the human story. How much sense does that make? Well, I agree that is really a big question, because one thing I can tell you is that that big founding piece of my Better Human Story, I mean, it's bigger than that now, but it's essential first piece. It did get out there. It's never been refuted. Nobody ever laid a glove on it. Really, it's not like, oh, we don't have to pay attention to this because here's the hole in the whole argument. I claim it's a watertight argument. I've been working with it for 50 some years, and there are little qualifications here or there, but it holds water. So it's not been refuted. As you probably surmise, it's not out there, which is why I feel like I'm still a man on a mission. People didn't accept it. There isn't a whole school of thought out there examining, like I've been doing, the ramifications of seeing the nature of the forces that have driven the evolution of civilization, which is what that's about. And it has lots of really important significance once you see that there is a social evolutionary force that would inevitably emerge whenever any species on any planet starts to invent its own way of life, extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. Inevitable. So you would think that if they hadn't refuted it, if nobody showed that you don't have to pay attention to this thing because it doesn't stand up, and here's contradictory evidence, and doesn't stand up, or what about this, and it doesn't stand up. None of that. Not out there very far. I mean, I expect that if we did a survey, we'd find some thousands of people who maybe thought it was a really important book, and some subset of them that continue to think that way. I hear such things occasionally, but really not what I'm aiming for, because what I'm aiming for is to be out there enough that it can have some effect on how we deal with the stuff that's happening. It should have helped liberal America perceive what was rising on the right, for example. And it should help humankind in general understand where we got to get to, and that we don't have a hell of a lot of time to get there, and other things that I could point to. You would think that if they were neither refutation nor acceptance, that at least people would be struggling with it. They would be grappling with, well, I'm not ready to accept it, but I can't see what I can't see what's wrong with the argument that claims to prove it or demonstrate it or whatever. But, since 6, 7, 8 years after the book emerged in '84, what happened was that the idea that had made something of a splash, not a huge splash, I don't want to overstate it, but something of a splash, and had gotten out there. And it made me feel like I had accomplished the mission that I had taken on in 1970 when I saw something important or something was shown to me. It just disappeared. It stopped being the challenge I assumed it was going to be to the way we have thought about our past. And you can imagine, I think, I got, in 1970, I had an experience which changed the course of my life. I mean, everything that's happened since has really been the result of being hit like a ton of bricks with that. Had a difficult road to take. I don't want to exaggerate the difficulty. I mean, I didn't miss a meal, but I had sort of a traumatic experience at Yale and then a great struggle at Berkeley and eventually got my doctorate in miscellaneous, my original theory of evolution, and only to find out that if you aren't a conventional commodity, you can't get onto the ladder in academia. All right, I had my doctor. I'm Dr. Schmuckler, big deal. I don't even use it. But I got that out there because the idea was so big. I mean, I had been educated in the big ideas that people had come up with over the centuries about how to understand aspects of the human world. I had grown up with it. I had studied it at Harvard as an undergraduate. I went to the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And anyway, that was what, and I saw, wow, you could put all this together and it would really show something. And I grew up with the belief that if you put something out there that would be important if it were valid and was presented in a way that was a craft of showing something using evidence and argument that I'd been trained in, that the world would have to deal with it. The idea that it might just walk away and ignore it wasn't part of the world as I understood it growing up in the family I grew up in. Writing a sort of a comprehensive theory of history or theory of social evolution or theory of the dynamics in the human world. In the subculture out of which I emerged, that was a kind of a holy grail, The books on the shelf were people who had attempted things. I mean, even a guy like Arnold Toynbee was a big deal, even though, his so-called histories didn't illuminate a whole hell of a lot. But they were filled with, a certain kind of learning. But he was a big deal. You would think that the thinking world is looking for something better than what Marx brought up, or something better than what Freud provided as a perspective through which to see the human world in some meaningful way that shows what's going on. And in the world I grew up in and got educated in, there were a couple of people, like I just mentioned, Marx and Freud, both had a significant presence in the thinking of the world of the 1950s and 1960s when I was developing a thought. But this is the best thing I've been able to come up with. I don't think I don't feel satisfied that it answers the question, how was it that the world was able to ignore this picture that I present that would have important ramifications. Ramifications like, essentially, I think, close to proving that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. I mean, if you can show that to be true, wouldn't that be a big deal? And then there are some other ramifications that I could articulate of why I think if all these were established in people's minds to be true, that it would have a big impact. But right now, to the extent to which I'm tuned in on contemporary thought, and I pay enough attention to enough different things that I think I would know if the following were wrong. Unlike in the 50s and 60s, I don't believe that there is any coherent, integrated, elaborated, big picture view of the human world that's well established I don't mean like majority of people. I mean, no majority of people were never Freudians or ever Marxians. But I don't think that there's anything remotely comparable to what they were in the 50s and 60s in the thinking of our civilization now. I just don't, and I think that is a symptom of part of our weakness. I mean, if you look at our overall condition as a civilization, and I'm talking about American civilization here because though I follow the news in a lot of countries, I don't feel like I know how much this is true. But I feel in America, there's a lot of ways in which things are falling apart, or things have been falling apart. There's a lack of wholeness. I mean, we could take, for example, how polarized, I mean, that is not, as Jennifer Rubin writes in an op-ed today in the Washington Post, we are not polarized. A big chunk of America has gone off the deep end. That's the problem. But the American people, not to use the word polarized, but we are very divided. We just came home from a trip, and in the mailbox there's my wife's issue of the week, and it depicts a man and a woman. The man's wearing a MAGA hat. The woman's wearing a My Body, My Choice or something like that shirt. And the two are, in a sense, opposed to one another. Like the relationship has soured. They are divided. And that's sort of emblematic of the condition of the American body politic is divided into antagonistic sides to a degree that was not true in the rest of American history, with the exception of the way America got divided over the issue of slavery to the point of fighting a civil war. That's one form of things falling apart. So I actually believe that there's been a movement over generations, going back before the 50s and the 60s. I think we've been having a challenge about holding things together in our vision for, I don't know, it's hard for me to really grasp some of these realities about eras that I didn't live in. But I have a feeling that that America was founded at a time where there was a philosophic orientation toward general principles that gradually attenuated, and also a degree to which the religious perspective of this being an extension of Christendom provided a degree of a coherence of view of a different sort. And there has emerged in our society over the course of my lifetime a greater and greater fragmentation of vision, in which people don't put the pieces together. Like liberal America didn't see the pattern of brokenness that was emerging on the right starting in the 1990s and then intensifying all the way up till you get to this grotesque point where, like I said, you don't even have the sheep's clothing over the wolf. I tried to, when I had my website during the W years, it's called nonesoblind.org, and it's a portal on my current website, which is abetterhumanstory.org. Um, I tried to show that um, that there's such a non-randomness about each thing that was happening from the right, that the impetus from the Republican Party was no longer a mixture, as it had been, of things that were, fairly constructive, acceptably constructive in a broken world, like political parties are, to one that was very consistently, somehow, every time, making things worse, whether it's climate change or race relations or inequalities between the richest and the rest, or go through the whole list. It was non-random. And that if you don't look to make connections, if you look at each thing separately, and Democrats would criticize what the Republicans were doing about climate change, or about campaign finance, or about white the dog whistles to white racism, but they weren't making connections. I think that things falling apart lead to looking at things just one by one in a world where really a lot of things are connected with a lot of other things. And if you look at the sort of the tissue of interconnection between causes and effects, you see some important patterns and you recognize what you're up against. And that, by the way, is the title of my 2015 book, what we're up against. And if you want to get a very good integrative picture, my best effort back then to integrate the American crisis with the human civilizational crisis, and from a variety of points of view in an integrative way. That's the best I could do in 2015. It's important to be able to see. There was a cartoon that I used as a metaphor sometimes. I think it's Gary Larson. It just flashed into my mind. A couple of explorers are they're walking around with their magnifying glass, and then they're looking for footprints. I don't remember what exactly the caption is, but it's got to do with that they're looking for something or other that's big and powerful, and was thought to be extinct, a King Kong kind of a situation, I suppose, and the picture's taken from like a height of 17 feet, looking down at them and from the side a bit, and you can see that they're standing in a footprint. That's what the big picture does for you sometimes, is you find out you're on the track of something that's bigger, bigger than Trump, for example. We pay a lot of attention to Trump, but he's just a part of something which is much bigger. I mean, before there was Trump, for example, there was a Republican base that had been transformed over the course of 25 years, say from the first Bush administration, 1990, to 2015. There was a change that had been wrought in the Republican base that made them such that, and I'm not claiming to understand quite the such that, but you can see from the effects that it must be there. They could look at a Donald Trump and say, we want to give him the powers of the presidency. I mean, that was kind of mind-blowing at the time. I mean, I started writing in 2015 that he's precisely the kind of person you don't want to give the powers of the presidency. I mean, if you were to ask the guys on Mount Rushmore, give us a portrait of the character, personality type, or however you want to put it, of the person who should not occupy that office and wield these powers that are described in the Constitution as belonging to the President of the United States. They would have come up with a description pretty much like Trump in terms of utterly selfish and dishonest and bullying and carrying not giving a damn about the well-being of the country or the people. I mean, you could just make a whole list of things you wouldn't want. And Trump manifested them quite blatantly. And already by 2015, the Republican base was such that he could get the nomination, and almost all the rest of the party would fall in line behind him. Wow. You got to make connections. You got to see the patterns developing. And in order to see the patterns, you really got to understand what are the forces at work that are consistently working in that direction. But if you have things are falling apart, meaning that people's minds are such that they know a whole lot about, let's say the Alvin Bragg case, and how you can prove that from this guy, David Pecker, who makes up these names, at the National Enquirer, it's a conspiracy to defraud the American public with respect to, not wanting them to know the truth, and you buy the silence of this person with whom he behaved in a way which, he survived the Access Hollywood tape. But anyway, he was scared. Whether he would have been damaged anymore by the Stormy Daniels testimony if she had gone public, or the other woman whose name, McDougal or something, I don't know if it would have hurt him. I mean, he survived Hollywood Access. I mean, I don't understand this Republican base. I mean, such a big deal about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, but that Hollywood Access tape, and they stick with him? Things falling apart, people falling away from what they supposedly believe in. That's a form of brokenness too. What comes to my mind, just to continue making connections, is Liberty University being charged a $14 million fine for their atrocious way that they dealt with women who came forward when they had been raped on their campus. I mean, I have experience with Liberty University, and it is really the opposite of Christianity. So that's another way in which things fall apart. You don't have Christianity staying together with Christians. I mean, there's something broken about having America's foremost Christian university be something which manifested in the world in the opposite of the Spirit of Christ, the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. There's something monstrous that developed, and that's a way of things falling apart. All these evangelical Christians who are supporting the guy who is just the opposite. I hear that some people are sort of embracing the fact that it's the opposite. Apparently, there's a church that has rifles as their altar and no crosses because Jesus is a wimp. And now is a time for struggle. I mean, fascism taking control of a religion, or the followers of a religion, people who believe themselves to be the followers of a religion, who are going to protect the unborn, but will align themselves with a force that's represented not by the teachings of the Sermon on the Cross, but has explicitly rejected them, or not so explicitly in the case of a lot of Republicans I know here in the Virginia Shenandoah Valley, where they're broken enough that in their rest of their lives, they really are good Christians. I mean, it's very nice living among here in Christendom, where I live, surrounded by Trumpites. But in their political life, they might as well have AR-15s instead of crosses in their churches when it comes to their politics. Just like Jerry Falwell Jr. Things fall apart. Well, going back to the question of the real problem, I'm thinking, might not be that people will think that my claims are not credible, though that one scares me because I don't want to be seen in certain ways. And that may still be a problem. But the fact that while Freud and Marx have pretty much, substantially disappeared. I mean, they were like high-flying stocks in the early 60s, and they're selling for just a fraction of the price here in 2024. They have fallen, and nothing has taken their place. So I do wonder whether the big obstacle I face is that I'm selling an integrative vision, a way of seeing things more whole, a perspective through which a lot of things make more sense. The meaning of them is made much clearer. What I'm up against, maybe people don't believe that there's such a thing, or they're not looking for such a thing, or they wouldn't want such a thing because the habits of thought are more, each game is the game you're playing. You can keep some records about passes completed and stuff like that, but each game's a separate drama. I don't know, is that what I'm up against? But still, I do hear what I feel able to do to get people to try it on, and trying to make it credible that maybe the claims I make for it, that it could help human civilization to survive, credible enough that, well, I got to check it out. But to want to check it out, you also got to want, would it be nice to know if the following kinds of things were shown to be true, or at least so true that they're important to keep in your mind as part of how you perceive the world. And so here are some of the things that I claim that my Better Human Story establishes. And one of them I mentioned before, which is that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. And I think I show that. And I wonder, I'd like to invite you to ask yourself, would that be important for you to know if it were true and shown to be true? It's true, I say, because of a social evolutionary force that inevitably gets unleashed when a creature takes the unprecedented step that our species took 10,000, 12,000 years ago extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by, like nothing any other creature had ever done out of life on Earth, out of the millions of species, by inventing its own way of life, which is to say, stepping onto the path of civilization. That social evolutionary force is so inevitable that I claim, and here's another one of those statements that I invite you to consider. Would you want to know if this were true? Any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, and here I'm encouraging you to think as I imagine to be true, but don't know anything really, except I know that there are billions and billions of galaxies, billions of stars, and there are so many planets, let's just put it that way, that I imagine that life has taken root on a lot of them. Not maybe a high percentage, but even a very, very, very low percentage of that number of planets would be such that there'd be a lot of planets in which life gets a hold. And once life gets a hold and the process unfolds, that we understand now to a very great degree from the evolutionary perspective, what happens as different things have differential success in getting their DNA into the future, and things emerge over long stretches of time and create stuff from bacteria to trees to fungi to vertebrates, and whatever it would be on these other planets. I have no idea what would be inevitable, but that there would be a process by which there would be speciation and the creation of ecological communities, and in which each actor would be playing a particular role. That's got to do with the fact that what gets selected for in this inevitable impersonal selection for what can get its DNA into the future, it selects for interactions among the elements or the species in the given biosphere that tend to work to perpetuate the system as a whole. And then if you eventually get to a creature that has a particular capability or kind of capability, eventually, at least, I don't know what proportion of the time, but I would imagine given enough time, if an asteroid doesn't wipe out the whole project before it happens, eventually you'll get to a creature like us human beings who have intelligence had been increasing since the dinosaurs got wiped out and the mammals rose, and then the primates. More and more intelligence, and then some kind of a increase that developed over 3 or 4 million years, tool use and taming fire, and eventually symbolic things, painting on walls, and probably religious rituals, and that something is happening that had never happened before, which was the extent to which a creature is starting to invent more and more of its way of life. Culture. There is a bit of culture to be found elsewhere in the animal world, but it is so rudimentary in comparison with what our hunting-gathering ancestors had. That our intelligence crossed a line into the capability of changing the rules, taking that unprecedented step, which I call the fateful step or a fateful step, of breaking out of the order which had made sure that all the interactions were consistent with the viability of the whole system. That's what evolution in a biological process. But we extricated ourselves from the biological system, and I claim that it inevitably unleashes a destructive force, because extricating ourselves from the order that evolution creates the biosphere, the ecosystems, whatever, plunges us into a situation where the interactions among the actors are not ordered in any kind of way, which has to do with the viability and well-being of the system as a whole. It is a new kind of disorder that inevitably emerges, and therefore that any creature that steps onto the path of civilization out of that evolutionary process will inevitably plunge itself into a disorder, which inevitably generates a social evolutionary force, which inevitably, the anarchic situation means a war of all against all, and the war of all against all means that only those cultural options that are capable of prevailing in a war of all against all can survive and spread, which is a process of selection. And since you've got two evolutionary processes, we've got a creature that was selected to live in a certain kind of niche that fit into an order. Now we've got a new social evolutionary process, which is selecting for the ways of power. And the selection for the ways of power, it can be shown in many ways, inevitably makes for a lot of trauma. Let's just leave it at that for now. It inevitably makes for something very destructive. It inevitably means that the civilization creating species will inadvertently have unleashed a force that will drive its civilization to develop, to evolve, so that only those that have power can survive. The selection for the ways of power means that what emerges as the face of civilization will not be a function of the nature of the civilization creating species. It'll be a function of the anarchic system into which the fateful step inevitably plunged them. It really can be shown that any creature that developed culture will be able to provide a whole range of possibilities for that selective process to choose among. And the selection for the ways of power will be very different than what would be the selection for things that were fulfilling to the needs of that creature. And that if any cultural animal will be able to provide a range of choices, including monsters, like these days, some of the biggest impact on the world we're living on right now are made by people like Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu. Put different people in power in those situations, or a different kind of regime altogether, and the world is not nearly so broken. But the ugliness we see in human history, and at this point I would say instead, that we can see in the world around us with the terrible things that have happened in Ukraine, and the terrible things that happen in Israel, and the terrible things that are happening in Gaza, and the terrible things that are being done here in America by the force of fascism. The ugliness we see in the human world around us is not human nature writ large. Now, if you could, those two go together. In fact, they're different ways of saying the same thing about the ugliness and the inevitability of the tormented and destructive social evolutionary process that hands that I call the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say in the way that the human world develops. If all those things were true, would you want to know them? Would that be worth studying the way people used to study some big pictures that people presented. If the answer is no, then my mission is, I'm happy to talk to you about other stuff at the little level, like should Biden debate Trump. I mean, all these things are very interesting to me too. But in terms of my mission, well, all that little stuff is in fact still, I mean, we are engaged in a battle, which is really, in America, is democracy versus fascism. It's part of a global current picture in which democracy is struggling against a rising force of fascism. And that in turn connects with what I'm talking about here, of what it means for a species to take the unprecedented step that we took, which leads to another proposition that I claim in this Better Human Story that I can establish. Ask yourself, would you want to know if this were true? I say that it can be shown, and not just in one way. I've got 3 or 4 ways of showing that our stepping onto the path of civilization unleashed a force that can be described as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, or consistently works to make the human world more broken. And I've proposed earlier in today's monologue, I would love to be in conversation, but this is the medium we got. I have proposed that a coherent force of that kind, working consistently in that direction, is a good definition of a force that one could reasonably call a force of evil. And I believe that I can show that there is a force not to be understood in supernatural terms, but to be understood as kind of a systemic dynamic that can be clearly inferred from looking through an evolutionary perspective at what it means for a creature to step out of its niche like we did. It is a good definition of what has traditionally been understood to be the way evil works. And I always say, because I know that liberals don't like the word evil, I do think, part of me over the years has avoided using the word evil because I've experienced all the resistance it gets. Let's just say a force of brokenness, a coherent force that consistently has the impact on the human world of making it worse. You can stop there, but I can show that there is something that behaves as evil has traditionally been understood to behave, that is an inevitable consequence that comes into the world of any creature that steps across the threshold, out of its niche, inventing its own way of life. So the hunter-gatherers, for example, to go back to that, they were cultural, but they were still living essentially like a primate band. But go down that trail of civilizing a little ways and you got gardens and herding of animals and a whole variety of things happening which change the whole nature of the human society in fundamental ways. Its size, its structure, its means of subsistence. It is a point of discontinuity in the history of life, a big step. And if you look at things in an evolutionary perspective, you see that it really is an unprecedented step that creates an unprecedented situation that has enormous consequences that the secular worldview hasn't really considered yet adequately. Maybe I should turn here. I mean, there are some other things I could talk about. That's the first 3 of, I think, 7 points that I bring together, multidimensional, integrated better human story. But maybe I should talk about taking things for granted. I mean, it's kind of a abrupt transition, but maybe it's time for a transition. I think about taking things for granted at a spiritual level and at an intellectual level. And I don't have anything particular to say about, well, maybe they can be integrated. Um, at the spiritual level, I think it's important um, to recognize when you've got something good. You can take bad things for granted too, like, take for granted that, some people get trapped into abusive love relationships. They sort of take for granted that they're going to be abused. Well, that's not healthy, but usually, I don't usually think about that. But I do think about, how people will say grace before a meal. Now, I think one should feel gratitude for the good things we've got. Religious people, of which I am not one, I have, I would like to have uh, um, a father worth loving and worshiping in the sky, or a mother, for that matter, some kind of just, merciful, loving God that I thank. Um, but I do believe that it's good for me if I do feel grateful for some good things that I have, like having a meal to eat rather than going hungry. I got ancestors. I mean, we've all got ancestors who had to deal with famine. I expect famines were sort of a part of human life, and they haven't entirely disappeared from the world. So, not taking things for granted means understanding that it isn't necessarily going to be that way. That it could be worse. I mean, I think maybe. I mean, should we not take for granted that we have air to breathe? I don't know. That may be asking too much, but it really is a lot better than not having air to breathe. We got submerged in water, we would be not taking for granted something that we tend to take for granted. One of the things is that gratitude is obviously good for people. People who have gratitude I think it's kind of clear they're happier. And the pursuit of happiness is one way of describing a major component of what life's about. And going back to that better human story, the pursuit of happiness has got a lot to do with um, behaving in ways that have been proven to be life-serving. So the pursuit of happiness can be integrated into what's life-serving versus what's life-destroying. That connects with what's good and what's evil, what's constructive and what's destructive, what's whole and what's broken. And there's a lot to be gained that the secular worldview hasn't really had, like really understanding that the moral dimension is not just a matter of opinion. But I'm not going to go further there. Where to go? One of the things that I took for granted that I see in retrospect that I took for granted, uh, which is that American democracy was something that could be taken for granted. It would continue. It wasn't as though I lived in a perfect America. The process of racial integration still had to be accomplished, but it was unfolding. The McCarthy era Joseph McCarthy and his very destructive playing with American paranoia was pretty ugly. But there was a sense in which people of my generation felt they could take a lot of things for granted, not just me. I've talked with people about it, and we never thought we would see something like Trump and this Trump party. So taking things for granted involves, for one thing, not recognizing that things might be otherwise. That it's not necessarily going to stay this way. And one of the consequences of not taking things like that for granted is that one works at it. One doesn't just coast along and say, well, this democracy is going to take care of itself. That one remains vigilant about the appearance of a threat when it's rising. There's a Sufi story that I like very much, and I haven't been able to find it again. It came with an illustration that showed a Sufi holy man or a Muslim holy man having this hut in the wilderness, the desert or whatever, where he's poring over these sacred texts and doesn't notice that there is this thing he thinks is just an insect buzzing around. Doesn't pay any attention to it. And there are iterations, I don't remember how they go, where this insect becomes bigger and bigger and more menacing. And still, this Sufi holy man is paying no attention to it. It's paying attention to the words on the pages. And finally, this thing has become so big that it bursts out of its disguise or its buzzing bug manifestation and becomes this mighty genie, D-J-I-N-N-E-E or something, spelled different ways. And it kills the holy man and blasts out of the hut, destroying its walls, blasts out into the wide world. If you don't take things, that's a kind of taking things for granted. It's focusing, not being vigilant enough to protect what needs to be protected. And that's what liberal America has been like for the last 30 couple years. And we are paying a big price as a society. And in terms of the values that we have, those of us who take for granted that the truth will defeat the lie and that justice will defeat injustice, and that no one's above the law. I wish that weren't such a close call these days between Trump and the rule of law that are battling. I mean, such a big victory for Trump lately with respect to the most important trial. It's still a battle. I mean, Trump is losing some of these battles, but he just won a major one, it would appear. That the election may happen before the American people get to see that he has committed some of the most serious crimes in American history. We should have been more vigilant about the Supreme Court. I've done a whole thing last week or the week before that about America's serious problem with the Supreme Court. Well, we could just take it for granted that we would have a Supreme Court that would take as its job, except with a few scandalous decisions, like Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson and Bush v. Gore, that we could assume that the Supreme Court would take very seriously its role as as the defender of the Constitution and the rule of law. That's what the judiciary is for. But what they did with Trump's giving him lots and lots of delay, what should have happened in December might not happen before the election in terms of the exposure of Donald Trump's most serious crimes. And the Supreme Court gave that to him. We took for granted that the Supreme Court would not be occupied territory by the force of fascism. But here is that buzzing bug that the right wing was building for year after year to get to the point where they could have a court that would do that. So not taking things for granted means being vigilant because it might be otherwise. You could be vigilant also about food. I mean, we thank thee, O Lord, for the bread we are about to eat and like that. You know, famine might happen someday. We Americans, you know, my basically middle class status, you know, I'm not going to starve to death. But with climate change and the spreading of deserts, certain areas of the world becoming uninhabitable, great migrations of people. The Syrian civil war was apparently indirectly or by stages the product of climate change. It wasn't inevitable that it'd be such a terrible thing, but give us this day our daily bread, not to be taken for granted. Intellectually, taking things for granted has a different meaning for me in terms of my preoccupations. I mean, you know, we're born into a world, and we're born with certain bodies. We're born into a world which has got certain things going on, and as children, we sort of take for granted that this is the way the world is, and in terms of that social evolutionary force, the one that I say is inevitable once you take the fateful step out of the biologically evolved order and start inventing your own way of life and create a new kind of life form that's not the product of natural selection, but has been invented by a creature that's got an unusual degree of creative intelligence. That we are the product of a 3.5 or a little more maybe billion year process that created us, has created a whole system of life on Earth. And we've got 10,000 years of dealing with this new kind of life form that was not crafted through generation after generation of generation after generation after generation of seeing what can get its DNA into the future. We have plunged into something new. And I grew up in a world in which the thinkers that I exposed myself to, studying world history, for example, including like H.G. Wells and Outline of History and other things I could get my hands on as a kid. And then eventually getting to the college level where I got exposed to some important thinkers who have been thinking about the sweep of human history. A name came to my mind, Vogelin, um, and talking about Athens and Jerusalem as these two places that we are the heirs to civilization as it emerged in those places. I mean, the Greeks gave us such and such and such and such, and ancient Israel with the Old Testament and the New Testament and the teachings of all that and the worldview of all that. We got that fed into our, and that's brings us up to here. And since then, we've had the Industrial Revolution, all that. All that's really important and interesting. But what it contains is it takes for granted the civilization, the fact that the world has got this civilization on it. We're born into it, we look around, that's the way it is, we take it for granted. And the way of not taking it for granted, that evolutionary perspective, is still fairly new. If you study the great social thinkers of late 19th and early 20th century, including people like Freud and Jung and these are not people whose minds have been shaped by an understanding of that 3.5 billion years of evolution. I mean, you read Totem and Taboo, no, you read Civilization and its Discontent, and Freud's saying that we're not really fit for living in society. That is a real unbridgeable thing, an unavoidable source of pain and neurosis and conflict. Hey, in the evolutionary perspective, we were social creatures long before we were human. Look at all the primates. They live in little societies. Living in societies is something our ancestors did and did and did and did for millions of years. Civilization and its Discontents is written by somebody who doesn't really understand the implications of evolution. He was born about the time Darwin published The Origin of Species. He had time to be educated in that. I expect he knew it, but it wasn't, I don't really know. When I studied these guys, and it's not just Freud, it's all over the place, the lack of perspective having to do with the 3.5 billion years and the evolutionary perspective. I kind of assumed that at some level they knew what Darwin had said. But I guess it takes a while for ideas to penetrate worldviews. I don't really know very much about how fast anything like that can happen. Anyway, going back, Jung always bothered me since I grew up with an evolutionary understanding. That wasn't my focus or anything, but when he talked about archetypes, I kept on asking, well, how can it be that human beings are born with these archetypes in our minds? How did they get there? They would have to be evolved. And I don't know that that's absolutely impossible to imagine, but I'm not sure that Jung's kind of archetypes could have evolved. I'm aware that there's something about, what was that? That there's birds, baby birds of certain species. If you, the shape of a hawk is something they seem to have programmed into their brains, that is a reason to be alarmed and to go to seek to hide. Not just any old shape, and it's not something they've learned. So maybe archetypes could be, but in any event, it was not part of the teachings of the thinking world that I was exposed to, that I was able to find, that recognized that the moment we stepped onto the path of civilization was a big point of discontinuity that changes the nature of the situation with obviously profound implications. I'm not aware of anybody having really ever said that. But that's at the core of that fundamental piece of the parable of the tribes, a book from University of California Press, still in print from SUNY Press. That is a really major point, that something happened that had never happened, created a situation that had never. The evolutionary perspective shows that there's something really new about the anarchy that we plunged ourselves into. And if you trace what the implications of that are, you end up with a better human story. Better both in the sense that it's more valid than the way we've understood it, including our religions. I mean, our religions have looked around the world as they found it, however far back the oral tradition goes that got laid down into the Old Testament, or all of it taking for granted that the civilization was there from the beginning. I think I mentioned last week that the sons of Adam and Eve are represented as herders and farmers. One herder, one farmer, and I still haven't looked up to see which was which. But no, that's not how it is. Herders and farmers are something really new happening. That after 3.5 billion years of an evolutionary process that's continually choosing what can survive over what cannot. No wonder a brother killed brother. There's a disorder that had been introduced. Maybe that cable, herder killing farmer or farmer killing herder, whichever it is, maybe that's a metaphor for the war of all against all that civilization plunges a creature into that's inventive enough to find itself into this new situation, which seems to be a breakout into, we're no longer going to be controlled by all these, this evolved biosphere. We're no longer in that niche with all of its limitations. Seems to be freedom, but it's not. Up to a degree, it's freedom. It means we can invent a whole lot of things. We can develop in a whole lot of ways, but of those ways, only certain ones are going to survive and spread. So that's one way, the not taking things for granted that we are born into. Civilization, my earliest memories, there are cars, there are paved roads, there were trains. There was electricity you could turn on. There was a telephone. There wasn't a TV yet, but before I was 8, we had one. All these things, the new things we don't take for granted, but what we're born into, we do. And we're born into civilization, and civilization itself is something we cannot take for granted. Yes, Athens and Jerusalem were big components of feeding things of lasting importance into our culture that get handed down through the generations. Yeah, but there's a real big story that precedes all that. By the time the Bible gets written, we've got empires. We've got big powers that can enslave little powers. We've got God commanding Saul to put every man, woman, and child to death in this city that he has them conquer. What is that? I forget it. I'm getting confused between this different stories in the Bible, but Jacob's son sparing somebody. Anyway, there's a lot of ugliness there. The people who wrote the Bible assumed that the ugliness they saw was human nature writ large because they assumed that civilization was a reflection of what we are. And what were we? We were creatures that so badly blew it, in the space between Adam and Eve and Noah. We made such an ugly world that God wanted to destroy the whole thing. It says that God even regretted, though how that's consistent with omniscience and such, but God regretted ever having made himself this creature. But the problem wasn't with the creature. Only if you take civilization for granted is the problem with the creature itself. What we see even in ourselves isn't a reliable window onto human nature. We've got some brokenness in us that was unavoidable living in a broken world. Broken in the sense that war of all against all means a lot of trauma. Broken in that if we're required by our societies, which have survived in this struggle for power, if we're required by them to internalize what they will tell us is what we should be, which will not be necessarily what's best for meeting our needs. Well, we're going to have an internal war between the internalized morality and the nature of the creature. In his unevolutionary point of view, Freud takes that for granted. He makes for human nature to be what he saw in Victorian Europe with this over strict superego that was making whole swaths of women of a certain social class hysterical, was the word, and which seems to have been a record of fathers sexually abusing their children, and which involved a whole lot of conflict between superego and id. So that he writes Civilization and its Discontents as though we really should take for granted that we're going to live in a world that is hostile to our needs and wants. It's not human nature writ large. The traumas of the sort that history has entailed was a product of civilization. Not that there were never any traumas for the hunter-gatherers, I'm sure, but there was a different situation. On the one hand, the species was getting more and more power over the earth, but on the other hand, civilization itself was out of control. Some of the worst of our potentialities, the spirit of the gangster, were playing a disproportionate role in calling the shots in the human world. So we're going to be the heirs of a lot of experience. I can trace some of that for myself. I'm 2 generations removed from pogroms, for example, where my grandparents survived raids by armed gangs of peasants seeking to kill people they could get their hands on. I don't know how much that influences me, but I think it's there. We can't look just at ourselves to say what kind of creatures we are. We are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, than we were taught by these religions that were written as, who looked around and said, God wanted to destroy this whole thing, so let's drown the whole world except for Noah and his family and 2 of every kind onto the ark. That's a pretty damning comment on what we supposedly are. And you know, I have to admit that I find it challenging to hold in my mind that we are indeed better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. That what Trump and Putin and Netanyahu and Hamas have brought upon us right now is not human nature writ large. It's taking some of the worst of our potentialities and mandating that the whole world absorb their impact. If all that were true, would you want to know? Also, not taking for granted, if we try to understand, well just what kind of creatures are we? We're creatures that can be put into a place, apparently, where like the Republican base in 2015, you can look at a guy who's behaving. I mean, he's much worse now, but it's plenty ugly in 2015. And I don't believe that the Republicans who voted for Ronald Reagan or the first Bush would have ever said, oh, this is our guy. How do you get there? Something was already wrong, and it's hard for me to hold in my mind the goodness um, in people, even those people. And I I know people around here who, like I've said, you can see their goodness. When I did talk radio out here, before they got changed into what they got changed into, I had hundreds of hours over 10 years of conversations with this very, very conservative part of Virginia about all kinds of questions. And I saw a lot of beauty. But now I see the vulnerability to being led into something very ugly. And it's hard for me to entirely keep in my mind that what we're dealing with is people living in a broken world that absorb brokenness, and that a force of brokenness can take them from where they started, which was, a decent conservative place, and turn them into people who somehow, how, I don't know, get led into supporting this force of fascism. It's hard for me to hold on to their beauty, but I do live among them. And a lot of people who only know them through their politics, like people live in the democratic Washington suburbs that I know, um, resist my saying that these are good and decent people. I know that doesn't capture the whole truth, but it captures a part of it, which I get to experience, and they don't get to experience it. They just see that they're aligned with this, essentially a fascistic force of evil. When you want to know what kind of creatures we are and be able to imagine how what we see in the world around us is not human nature writ large, I like to conjure up the story of research that was done back in the 1950s by a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin. He was named Harlow. Um, and Harlow separated newborn rhesus monkeys from their mothers as soon as they were born and raised them apart from their mothers and with pseudo mothers, one of which had something that you could cuddle against and one of which was just wire and was not comforting at all. And the ones that got comforted by even having some fabric that they could cuddle against were able to live like normal rhesus monkeys in rhesus society, more or less. But the ones that had nothing to cuddle with, they were completely messed up. They couldn't function in rhesus groups. They couldn't reproduce. They couldn't create a mating relationship. We would not say about those rhesus monkeys that they were rhesus monkey writ large. They were broken. This experimenter, somewhat cruelly, I would say, broke them by not giving them what they needed. Not only what they needed, but what they were born, that evolution had crafted them to expect what they were sure to get in a rhesus monkey world, which is a mother that would take care of them, that would give them some comfort. So our nature as human beings, like with rhesus monkeys, but even more so, we've got sort of what's built into us, and then there's what evolution kind of crafted us based on the assumption that this would be the kind of world that we would live in that would tend to finish us, that we would be completed as we unfolded from our innate tendencies, combined with what you could assume our social cultural environment would provide us with. But we civilization creating creatures stumbled into a disorder that warped our environment in ways which had to do with power and not with human needs or human nature. And that means that to some degree, we're like the rhesus monkeys with just the wire mothers, nothing to comfort them. What degree? I don't know. But the principle is there. The evolutionary perspective, again, comes in and tells us that human nature is the combination of the inborn and the to be assumed will be there to finish the job. And that assumption is not correct in a world that has been shaped by the demands of power, because we have stepped out of the biological evolutionary order. The value of understanding that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be may be self-evident. I don't know, I'll articulate a little bit in case it's not. If you've got a culture that's teaching you that God wanted to blow us off the map and repented of ever creating creatures as behaving as badly as humans were at the time of Noah, and a culture that makes a core concept to explain a whole lot, original sin, and in the Calvinist religion, the idea of human depravity. That'll be a burden. And it will affect our expectations. Of course we're evil creatures. We were born to be evil creatures. We are so inherently broken, but it's not inherent. I don't claim to know how inherently whole we are. But I do claim to prove that we are more whole than we have imagined, and that the expectations we should have of ourselves, we should be living up to, and not, I think we has historically done, somewhat down to, because of the way we consider ourselves to be so flawed inherently. And we should have compassion for ourselves. You know, it's not because we were evil that we took that unprecedented, fateful step. is because we were unprecedentedly creative. We had the capacity to do it. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, we moved further and further down the path of being cultural animals, and then took a step that plunged us into a disorder that we have not yet brought under control. So one of the things I claim is that I can show a few things about the challenges that we face. That winning this election in 2024 is by layers part of a way bigger challenge we have to order our civilization well enough and soon enough that human civilization can endure and thrive on this planet for the long haul and compatible with the rest of life on Earth, and not destroy ourselves through a nuclear holocaust or through bringing the whole biospheric temple down on our heads. If certain important things, I mean, I don't claim to say I've got a detailed roadmap about how we can succeed, but I can say some things that could help us be clearer about the nature of the challenge and meet it better. If that were true, would you want to know? Well, if you would want to know, well, please follow me here. Please look at some of the other videos that I've offered already and continue to offer. I'm doing my best as a video maker, but I have to admit that my training and my craft were that of a writer. And I think that the strongest case that I can make to show that all these things that I've been saying I show are valid, I make in writings, and I refer you there to my website, abetterhumanstory.org. But if you prefer the oral, I'm going to give it everything I got every Monday at 11 in the morning, every Thursday at 11 in the morning, and then I'll probably take a break. And if history is any indication, I might come back and make some shorter videos than this one on related topics or whatever. I will do my best to utilize this medium to show that this better human story actually does capture some important truths that put some things into an importantly different light. Seeing things whole is really worth doing for reasons intellectual and spiritual and emotional. There's a, I don't know if the word pleasure is to be used. You know, we take pleasure in art. And one of the ways I understand what art is that the artist finds some way of making things whole and meaningful. You don't have a lot of irrelevancy. If you have a story, like you're watching a movie, and I've indicated I'm a real movie lover, there will not be, in a good movie, as far as I'm concerned, a scene in which you're left wondering at then and at the end, what the hell did that contribute to it? There's something about seeing things whole that moves us. And seeing things intellectually as a whole partakes of that that the artist gives us, like a piece by Mozart. It's just no majesty, just the right number of notes. Uh, I had an ambition to see things whole the way mystics do, the oneness of it all. I'm not very good at that. I've had some moments, but there is something deeply fulfilling about, the mystics will tell you, about seeing the oneness of it all. And I want to say also that there is something that is also spiritually meaningful about an integrative vision of this human drama that we're involved in. We evolve biologically, and then we unleash this other non-biological evolutionary process. And we have within us some things that the biological evolutionary process put in us that are meaningful things to own. They help reveal the reality of good and evil, because we've got something built into us that experiencing things in evaluative terms. And one can build logically and empirically from that reality, seen from the evolutionary perspective, into the realization that the moral dimension is real, important, and life-serving. And there's a ubiquity in the human genome that has to do with the capacity for spiritually transformative experience. That's simply a fact that people have these experiences. And they experience things in certain terms, and it has a certain power, and has certain characteristics. That's just fact. The secular worldview hasn't perceived the implications of this evolutionary installed capacity. It wouldn't be there if it didn't serve life. If the ancestors who had lacked that capacity hadn't comparatively failed to get their DNA into the future compared to those ancestors who had that capacity. The evolutionary perspective, again, brings into perspective that we actually have within us, not that any of this stuff is simple, we have within us, from the processes that created us, some guidance about the good. That which is fulfilling for us, that which tends to serve our survival, the survival of our DNA, that which are truths that it is beneficial to pay attention to and to follow, because apparently those impactful truths have been selected for. The capacity to have those has been selected for. Good is something that is real, that you can see in an evolutionary perspective in those inborn experiential tendencies. Evil is something which inevitably emerges because of the disordered nature of the system into which the civilization creating creatures steps itself into. And there at the center of the human drama is the battle between these two forces. I believe that to get back to the smaller picture, that American partisan politics has become something extraordinary. It's not a mixture between it's not a battle between two mixtures of the destructive and the constructive. Both the Republican and the Democratic Party sum up both. We've got ourselves into a battle, which is a version of, um, uh, which is basically one between the Trump side of things, which is consistently making the human world worse in all of its words and deeds. And by default, anything that's fighting against them at each of these points of battle that we've got has got to be pushing in the opposite direction from brokenness. So we've got the battle between good and evil that is one of the templates over which Biden versus Trump can be laid. It is basically isomorphic, as the mathematicians would say, with fascism versus democracy, which is isomorphic between what's life serving and what's life denying or destroying or degrading, which ultimately is a battle between good and evil. The liberal world doesn't think that the battle between good and evil has any reality. So they don't bring to that battle quite the moral passions that such a battle so conceived would imply. I like to bring in these blockbuster movies of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Avatar, where you can see how people get swept up with their passions in the battle between good and evil. Well, we are engaged in such a battle and in this upcoming election and beyond, but this is the most immediate crisis. And it helps to get those passions enlisted, which involves changing the secular worldview in some important ways. Seeing things whole in a secular way, which is all I'm proposing. I'm proposing nothing that doesn't fit into the secular way. I'm saying we can look at the facts and we can process it through reason, and we can discover all these things to be true. And what's true is America is facing a showdown that we simply must meet. And we'll meet it better if we can plug into our moral and spiritual passions that are a reason. There's a reason why they're there, because they have been life-serving. And the more we heed the messages that we feel, and don't say what some kids have said to me that I've taught, oh, what the Nazis did at Auschwitz isn't what I would have done. But it seemed right to them, so it was right to them, for them. No, what's right is based on realities, important realities that are built into us because they have been life-serving. And the better we tend to them and the better we fight for them, the better our chance of survival and the better the chance that we will build a world in which human needs and the needs of other sentient creatures get fulfilled, and there is less suffering and misery like the force of brokenness imposes on people. Fascism does not lead to human well-being. Democracy is the best thing we've come up with. Fighting for democracy is fighting for the good. Thank you. Please sign up to follow me. I will give you the best I got. I'm a man on a mission.